Tell me, let's go back to 2007. How dire, how bleak were things looking for record stores back then?
Well, 2007 was the year that the final Tower Records stores were liquidated. I think
Hmm.
actually it was December 2006.
Okay.
Um, and the independent stores were, looking at this and thinking, do we still have a livelihood?
Hmm.
Um, Now some of them took the approach that maybe this is an opportunity as opposed to a death sentence.
Okay.
But there was the other trend. I mean, not only Tower, but I mean here in New York, HMV as well as Virgin Megastore had, I think both of them had two stores each, like these department store like
Yeah.
spaces. And they tried to diversify their merchandising by, getting into T-shirts and, accessories, and they sold, DVDs and, anything that was sort of media, popular culture
Yeah.
orient. But I guess the real estate realities, plus, we were still dealing with the aftermath of Napster for about a half dozen years.
Hmm.
Um, that they said it just wasn't worth it,
Yeah.
but they didn't have as big a footprint internationally as Tower did.
Right.
Um, so, so some of these scrappy stores were thinking, well, they never really gave up completely on vinyl, and 95% of their sales were basically coming from CDs,
Hmm. Yeah.
which there wasn't really a much of a profit either, because it was a fairly low price product. That the wholesale cost was high.
Mm.
So they'd have to eke out a profit, especially
Yeah.
with the big box retailers. Here in New York, they also disappeared, but there were a couple of stores, chain stores like the Wiz. And the funny thing is, I'm wearing a Crazy Eddie shirt. They disappeared long before the others, but Circuit City, they would sell new
Sure.
releases on CD for $9.99, with the hopes that they would come in and buy a washing machine or something.
Yeah.
So that lost leader
Yeah.
reality. So then, meanwhile, these independent stores, some of them also diversified into comic books,
Mm.
and also I had a used record section. Some of
Yeah.
them, there weren't a lot of new records being pressed at that point. So
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, there were some independent labels that were still doing it, and some audiophile labels, but um they discovered back in 2007, to your question, that these records, as soon as somebody would bring in a collection, they would sell. Now, they weren't highly priced. I mean, they're usually like $2 or
Yeah.
$3.
Yeah.
But it was something to look at. And then on the comic book side, two stores in particular in Maine, as well as in Atlanta, Georgia, around the same time, came up. Notice that the comic book industry had this thing called Free Comic Book Day. The comic book publishers would offer comic books to the stores.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not a comic book collector myself, but I think they're very similar to record collectors.
Mm.
Certain type of personality.
I
That
agree. Yeah.
um, so they said to Michael Kurtz, why don't we try something like this? Um, Now, what Record Store Day did was not give away free records.
Right.
But they came up with the idea, well, maybe we could get them to the labels to press limited editions of new vinyl.
Sure. Well,
Um,
sorry to interrupt, but the one thing I
yeah,
really thought was interesting in your book was as this comics book day was the impetus, but the shift was really interesting that it wasn't necessarily about the format as it was for comic books. It was about the brick and mortar and the nostalgia that we have with the stores. I thought that was an interesting difference.
right. And actually, going into the book, um, I didn't realize that I thought the book was all about the limited editions.
Oh, okay.
And Michael, as well as Carrie Colleton at Record Store Day, they said no, it's about the record store day. It's about record store culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a light bulb went over my head, and I said, that's what I experienced as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
I liked hanging out at the record store.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's where you meet friends, you meet bandmates, you learn about new music, you potentially, meet girlfriends, boyfriends,
Yeah.
partners, but
Yeah. Yeah.
spouse. Um, so and you learn about life,
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh, for
yeah,
sure.
so when I realized that still existed, although I think it lost some of its luster during the CD era. It wasn't as
Oh.
fun as it is now, I think.
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I still enjoyed it. HMV was the chain we had here in Canada. And when I would go to the mall with my mom or with my girlfriend or something, that's where I would go and spend all my time. But you're right. I mean, I think there's so much more excitement because of the new and mixed in with the used and all of the possibilities that you can find. I just want to fast forward for a second because and this interview will be all over the place because there's so much to the story and really the history of Record Store Day. I really want to leave for our listeners to discover in your book because it's a lot more nuanced than we can cover. But what's so interesting is that when this idea was conceived in 2008 and or 2007, 2008 and taken off in 2008, you look now, here we are in 2023 and mission accomplished. I mean, I was just in a record store in a small Canadian town. I don't know if there's not an iconic record store in any way. And it was a Saturday afternoon in March. So we're not talking record store day. We're not talking a beautiful summer day. And it was packed for no reason. There was no sale. There's 30, 40 people in there. The cash register was going nonstop. I spent $80, no special occasion at all. I was thinking about that because I thought, what is it, the store's anniversary? No, it's just a Saturday in March. And I thought as I'm reading your book, wow, mission accomplished. If that's what the plan was for these store owners and this association to say, how can we bring attention? It looks like it worked.
Well, I wouldn't say that was the strategy right from the start. They were just thinking, let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks.
Right. Sure.
And they didn't really they knew they had to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try this. It was more of
Yeah.
So you're right. I think it exceeded beyond anyone's imagination.
Sure.
And the way it caught up around the world.
When
Yeah,
when was it mentioned on Saturday Night Live? What year? How many years into it before they joked about
it's
it?
only a year or two. It's in the book.
Yeah,
I
that's right.
the date. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 2010
Um,
or 2009, maybe even.
yeah.
Yeah.
Then they made a joke of it.
Yeah, that's how you know you made it.
Yeah.
I want to let's talk about vinyl. The book has some interesting stats back in 2012, so even 4 years into Record Store Day, vinyl made up 2.4% of physical music. And then 20 years later, or I should say, I guess 10 years later. So sorry, maybe I'm getting this number wrong. I think maybe 2.4 is in 2002 was the book. I maybe mistyped that. But we're now to a point where it's a significant percentage. I mean, incredibly significant percentage of physical music sales, and I think year over year has seen growth since that time. You mentioned, and not even slowing down in 2020. It doesn't appear to be plateauing, really. Maybe if you zoom out, is this growth that you think will continue? Like, where are we on this trajectory, do you think?
Well, I think we're in a very healthy space, and we need to look at what happened over the last few years, especially since the pandemic hit. There were supply chain issues.
Hmm. Hmm.
The only there was there were only two lacquer suppliers, and one of them had a fire that killed the
Right.
business completely. So this company in Japan has just managed to basically sustain an entire industry, which is pretty incredible.
Well,
But I think more importantly to your question, the younger demographic um, are in love with records, vinyl records. And I think part of that is related to the pandemic. So what happened was baby boomers like myself, remembered that I used to like records, and yeah, I
yeah.
threw them out to get CDs, and then, and then they would start reading in the press or saw something on television about vinyl was back, and they became intrigued, and they needed a hobby. They were spending more time at home than they ever did
Yeah,
before,
yeah, yeah.
right? So, and I think their kids also were intrigued by their parents getting into this stuff. And yeah, certain artists like Fleetwood Mac and the Beatles are timeless. Yeah, you're
Hmm.
gonna love that music. And I know because my daughter is 25 years old and she loves, Fleetwood Mac especially.
Mm.
Um, so it it's sort of like what happened was that younger demographic also had artists like Taylor Swift, Adele, that also saw the potential in vinyl as a deluxe product. And that's the amazing thing about this comeback. Not only was it resurrected, but it became a deluxe product.
Yeah, yeah.
So in 2022, 7 out of the 10 artists were, either millennial or Gen Z type
Wow.
artists. People like I mentioned Taylor Swift.
Yeah,
She sold almost 1 million copies of Midnights
yeah.
on vinyl.
Wow.
But it was other Kendrick Lamar. I mean, there are other genres that haven't even sort of scratched the
Hmm.
surface.
Hmm.
Like the 100 top hip hop records albums, at least, if you go to Spotify, you'll learn that half of them are not even available on vinyl.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
So, I mean, again, that shows potential, if they're
that's a good
there,
point.
they're available to be bought. But the other thing about the numbers is those numbers are not to be trusted. That's in
Okay.
my,
Yeah, yeah,
I think it's only scratching the surface
yeah.
of, because, and the way I know this is through my other hat, of being the co-founder of Making Vinyl. Now when we started that in 2017, we did it on a hunch. We
Mm.
just, saw this trend of, demand for vinyl increasing, and we rounded up the dozen of so plants that were already, making records on both sides of the Atlantic, the bigger names.
Yeah.
What we didn't know was that there were a dozen companies either already just starting their business or about to start business in the audience. And in 2018, the same thing happened. But what was interesting about 2018 was the RIAA mid-year report had just come out, and I'm just citing from their report from the stage that they said 9.8 million, it was nine something million units were shipped in the first half of 2018. And in the audience, where the major distributors as well as manufacturers are yelling back at me, those numbers are way low. And afterwards, Steve Sheldon, who owned Rainbow Records in California, he said to me, I did 6 million myself.
Yeah, oh my gosh. And they would know.
So
They have more accurate numbers of what's
yeah,
being made.
now,
Yeah.
now we're not suggesting that every record pressed is a record bought at retail, but on the other hand, the reports from retailers, this stuff does get sold by and large.
Yeah.
And I think the best example of that is, here we are more than 15 years into, almost 16 years into this resurgence, and there aren't cutouts like there were in the 70s and
Mhm.
early 80s, that you could buy records for $1 or $2, brand new records that was still sealed, like the overstock type
Yeah.
stuff. I think if these records weren't being bought, two things would have happened. They would have certainly pressed less,
Mhm.
or it doesn't make sense that or cutouts would have happened,
Yeah.
would have surfaced, because it could be a potential lucrative business for
Yeah.
somebody.
That's right. Well, that's a great point. And when I read that part of your book, I was thinking about our independent labels that listen to this show, including myself. If I'm doing a run of 200, I know that 100 are earmarked for some fans. 50 are going to Bandcamp, 50 are going to the local record store, or I'm selling out of my house. None of those numbers are being reported to SoundScan. And I'm just talking about 200 here. And I think it can be said for a lot of stuff that's happening on Bandcamp. And I know if you add a SKU, Bandcamp will report it, but not everybody does that. Not everybody will get an individual SKU for a short run of 100 or 200. So I think there's a lot of stuff happening on Bandcamp and happening with indie artists in short runs that aren't being
Well,
reported.
you're absolutely right about, especially touring artists,
Hmm.
that those records never get counted. But also they the RI double, not RIAA, I'm sorry, the what used to be known as
Yeah,
Nielsen,
I don't know the new
Luminate,
name. Okay.
they only have 30% of the independent stores reporting numbers to them. So
Wow.
they are projecting and waiting. And the first article I did about the vinyl resurgence came out in 2016. And in that, I was able to get somebody from the RIAA admit that they were projecting.
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Yeah.
so then I asked Luminate, this last report that came out, that they said that it was like 4% growth or something like that. And I said, I just don't buy that based on, what we hear from the manufacturers. And I asked, well, how do you determine these numbers? I mean, what's your methodology? And I received a vague statement about the different, factors that go into this formula,
Yeah.
including not only physical, but also digital.
Okay.
Once they melded it together, I was like, you're not telling me what the secret sauce is here,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and
That's
then the
funny.
other thing about that, I mean, the thing that the mass media love to do, it's clickbait.
Yeah.
They say, records are back, but guess what? 50% of the people buying records don't even have a record player. Meaning that they're mostly kids, and they just like to put it up on the wall.
Sure.
And so I went back to Luminate and I said to them, well, is it possible that these purchasers are buying records as a gift for somebody else, and they personally don't have a record player. I mean, I studied empirical research when I was in grad school, and this is
Yeah,
like a basic, like you could make a survey, support whatever you want, but
that's
that's just
right.
shoddy,
Yeah,
research, and to make it as if it's gospel is
yeah.
doing a disservice to the industry, really. I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Making vinyl was actually working on, coming out with a more comprehensive report about this stuff.
That's awesome. That's exciting. Um, I want to ask you about a potential. Well, let me tell you my memory of CDs because I was a teenager, and for me, I mean, my connection with vinyl is more recent because I would have been a kid in the '80s with cassettes, and then when I was a teenager, it was all about CDs. But then when I was in high school, Napster came out, and I saw that what my theory of the death of the CD was that the mystery was taken away from the CD. Because when I was a kid, I only knew two people, really one and a half people who had a CD, they were a band and they had their own CD. It was a pretty novel thing to know somebody in the early 90s, mid 90s who had their own Glassmaster manufactured CD. So there was this mystery to it. So if a band had their own CD and they were touring with a CD, then they were legit. If you had a real CD, and especially if it was in stores, then you were a legit band. And I think once the Napster came along, you could then download the source files, and then a couple years later, you could get your a CD burner at your computer, and then you could get CDs, and very quickly you could make that once mysterious thing. I'm wondering, is there any sort of potential threat to vinyl like that? Is there any sort of, to me, that was the cancer of CDs, is that it was no longer exciting because we had the files, we could put them on our phone or on our iPod, or we could literally make and print a CD at home. In fact, I remember retailers for a real short window experimenting with print on demand CDs in store, which
Right.
was did not work at all. Is there any threat to vinyl? What happens when we can print one-offs or 3D print vinyl? Do you see that
Yeah.
in any way?
Well, it's not going to happen on the LP side of things. And in fact, there was a company that started, well, they promoted for about $1,200. You can make your homemade records, but those were like 10-inch records. I mean, I
Mm,
don't even think they were 10-inch. I think they were like somewhere between 7 and 10-inch.
okay.
And you could only put like maybe the most 10 minutes of music on one side.
All right.
So it was basically, it might be useful for a musician. I think that the bigger threat is actually overseas bootlegs.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it's interesting, the capacity crunch that took place over the past 4 or 5 years, the demand exceeded, and as a result, you might have to wait as much as 10 months to put in an order and actually get your records.
Hmm.
That's not the case right now. It's like down to like 3 months or so because
Yep.
major plants have increased capacity substantially, and then all these new smaller plants came about. But the new small plants are going to realize that one or even two pressing machines might not cut it in terms of getting the economies of scale,
Hmm.
because the raw materials are expensive, and
Hmm.
that. So it'll be interesting, but I want to get back to what you were saying about the CD stuff.
Yeah.
So in the early 80s, the music industry really had to figure out something new, because a couple things started competing with it. One was MTV. You had, if you had cable TV, you were able to see the latest hits and even some of the old ones with pictures. I mean, it was even better. It was
Hmm.
even great. And then you also had the VCR, and you could record it. And then you had later on you had, around the same time you had video games emerging in the late 70s. And young people who were like the primary buyer of records all of a sudden didn't care. They had other pastimes to deal, so I think the CD came around at the perfect time. But what's really interesting is the way that they made it stick was, and in short, that the LP would be replaced, is they said, well, we won't take returns any longer on LPs, unsold merchandise.
Yeah.
But we will on CDs to make sure that the retailers stock them.
Yeah. So no risk.
Right. And the interesting thing about that is, so that happened with the final major labels basically said, we're not going to give you the option to, it's a one-way transaction. That happened like 1991. But there was like an interim period, I think it was from like about 1985 to 1990 or so, that cassettes were like the most popular format.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was just like an interim step,
Yeah.
Which I find really interesting. But going back to how the LP came back this time, it was the same thing. They basically said, we're not going to accept returns. So when Record Store Day emerged, they said, we'll press them, but it's a one-way transaction.
Right.
We're not going to take anything back. Now, that actually helped in another way, too, because obviously during the 80s, there was a lot of corruption going on. And I mentioned the cutouts, that was part of it, but there was also more than that. 2 sets of books, the old adage, ship platinum, return gold.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Or even vice versa.
Yeah.
And major records. I remember, buying cutouts by The Who and things like that. You think these had to sell better than, what was happening here. So that, and also, there's this whole gray area type of thing of counterfeits. And, I recently bought, the past year, I was in London actually, and I bought a Sonic Youth record that I had never seen on vinyl before, and it turned out to be a bootleg, but it was pretty good. It sounds pretty good. The artwork was not bad.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a shoddy type of bootleg. But I think the other thing the CD did was get people used to paying twice as much for what they already owned.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know if the vinyl resurgence would have happened the same way, that they could start charging $25 for a record.
Right.
If it wasn't for, now millennials have no idea, like they didn't know that the first CDs were $18 and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. And I edited a magazine for 8 years called Media Line that covered CD and DVD production and manufacturing. So CDs were very good to me. It's interesting. I still own probably about 1,200, 1,500 CDs that but I had pared down that.
I have two. I don't have 1,500. I probably have 100, but I've pared down from maybe 400.
And the other thing is, in a moment of madness, this was after my magazine was killed. Well, first I was let go, and then they were selling the company, and it held on for a few more months, but then they killed it completely. So I decided to sell most of my vinyl collection, my DVD collection, and my CD collection. I did hold on to like about 1,000 CDs. And I held on to about 150 records. Although I had 2 different boxes that said "Do not touch." and one disappeared, and there was like really good stuff
Oh
lost
wow.
in that one. Like a autographed copy of Patti Smith's Radio Ethiopia,
Oh
and
wow.
first edition of Roxy Music, and
Yeah.
collectible
Yeah.
type
Yeah.
stuff.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
So okay, so let's go to back to Record Store Day and tackle some of the topics around that. I read that about, and especially how we're going to relate this to our audience of small independent record labels, but I read from you that about half of the music submitted, and this is something I had no idea was really going on, but half of the music submitted to the Record Store Day committee doesn't get accepted. This is surprising to me. Can you explain how this process works? How a title becomes a Record Store Day title?
Well, this is how I was told about how it happens. That there is a committee, that there's some sort of form, and the label needs to make the case. What's so unusual about this?
Right.
Um, and if it's just a reissue, a lot of times they won't do it
Mm,
unless it was something that was out of print for a long, long time.
mm,
Um, so, I mean, I haven't sat in on any of those meetings that determine this. Um, I mean, one of the complaints about Record Store Day, I don't know if this is one of your questions, but that there's too much. There's a glut. It's
okay.
hard to like,
Yeah.
and which I think is a fair
From the
thing.
perspective of the buyer or for the customer?
What do you mean, the buyer or the
Like
customer?
from there's too much titles
The,
from
the
the record
consumer,
stores?
no, from the consumer
Okay.
perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The stores too have that complaint
Yeah.
too, because
Yeah.
they can't really pay for that much
Yeah.
stock at one time.
Yeah.
Um, and then especially after, I mean, the pandemic, they really had no choice.
Mm,
They needed to make it safe, and they kept on, pushing the date, and then they broke it up into 3 different
yeah.
drops,
Yeah.
and then the next year they did 2 drops. But getting back to what you said earlier, I meant to mention this. I mean, their philosophy is every day is Record Store Day.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, it did make like special days, and then they, I think it was about 6 years or 7 years into it, they introduced Black Friday,
Right.
like with another,
Yeah.
round of like limited editions. All I know is every Record Store Day or Black Friday, I'm set back at least $300-400. Oh, I mean, I did my taxes a few weeks ago, and I realized I spent $4,000 on records last year.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't want to add that up. I'm probably in the same boat. I don't want to add that up. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I mean, I had a record store on the show. We were talking about record stores, indie record stores, and he's a friend of mine. And I asked him about Record Store Day, and I was expecting some juicy insights into how it's this corrupt thing and how he hates it. But he had nothing but good things to say about it and how it really is, and I think you had mentioned this a little bit in your book, is how it really is just one day, but it has affected the other 364 days when it comes to people's interest in vinyl and people's interest in record stores. And so, and I know that you've talked, I think that the team at Record Store Day has defended the how expensive and how little margins are in these actual titles. But these titles are really just billboards for vinyl and for record stores. And so I mean I still know that the guy who I had on the show, that Record Store Day is still his biggest day. But the fact that it's raised every other day of the year is the bigger story for him that he's happy about.
Yeah, I think also in terms of Record Store Day, what really bothers them is when on eBay, people will start selling even before Record Store Day. They will
Crazy.
list records that they don't obviously have in hand, because the only people who have them are the distributors at that
Mm.
stage. They usually ship to the retailers about 2 weeks before. Um, and that they speculate with these ridiculous prices. I mean, and the other thing about the misconception about Record Store Day is Record Store Day doesn't have any kind of economic piece of the pie. They
Okay,
don't they don't receive a percentage of those sales.
that's very
They don't
interesting.
sell the records,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um,
Um,
are they
yeah.
like a nonprofit, or how is it? Is it who owns this trademark?
Yeah, I mean, I know they protect the trademark, and I think it's in the book. There was an organization that was trying to do something similar in Australia, and but they didn't want to follow the rules that Record Store Day has set up for
Mm.
retailers.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and so they did not get permission. They
Mm.
still did it anyway, but it didn't, bombed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What role do you think really small indie labels play in Record Store Day? And I understand that you can't just submit a record to the list. I think it takes some of the scarcity and some of the interest and excitement out of this list. But what role then should us small indies play in Record Store Day? It seems like there isn't much for us to do, but just to sit back and watch and hope that the tide raises all boats.
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know if an independent label needs Record Store Day.
Mm,
Um, it's basically the key to any successful business.
mm,
Know your customers, have a database, and market to them directly.
mm.
Um, it'd be great if you could get retail distribution, of course. But yeah, I mean, there's like a cachet with if you put the gold stamp on it, it makes it seem more valuable.
Yeah,
I,
that's true. Yeah, yeah.
but especially touring bands, I don't think that would make a difference.
Mm.
If you're going to sell a single,
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that's a good point. Um, Talk to me about Record Store Day and the current culture around vinyl, and what it's done for the public's appreciation and expectation of artwork and packaging. It's one of my favorite parts of the Renaissance, and I had a distributor tell me a couple years ago, don't bother with black. Like people don't want black vinyl anymore, and and you can smell a major label release from a mile away as soon as you open it up. There's no inserts. It's not reverse board. It's not gatefold. It's a black vinyl. Um, I'm just kind of curious as to what you've noticed when it comes. I think you mentioned earlier in our conversation about it's a deluxe. It's all about deluxe now and premium products.
right. Well, actually, you just reminded me of um, when you mentioned the artwork. I mean, so this was a Record Store Day release. It
Mm.
was on Modern Harmonic, which is an offshoot of Sundays.
Yep.
Uh, which, by the way, Sunday's founder Bob Irwin, back in 2002, I interviewed him, and he told me vinyl is back in 2002. I
Wow.
thought he was kind of crazy. I didn't believe him.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
and and but in any case, he was obviously right. um, but anyway, I mean, getting back to this, I mean, it's an album of Middle Eastern music, which I sort of am always been intrigued by.
Mm.
But I just thought the artwork was so fantastic. It's a 3 record set, so it was pretty pricey.
Yeah.
But I loved it,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was definitely worthwhile. Usually every Record Store Day, I buy one thing that I wasn't planning on going in for. Um, could have been like a band that I liked years ago and just didn't have many of their albums, or something unusual like that,
Yeah.
that just caught my eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a part of it that I like. And I think you alluded to why the majors have been reluctant to get involved or to do certain things because they're all about the margins. And I think you had mentioned something interesting about they just have like internal policies that they're not allowed to exceed a certain price when it comes to or costs when it comes to packaging. I find that to be really interesting, and it's really where indies have, especially bigger indies like Numero Group and Light in the Attic, where they can do really special packaging.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Light in the Attic put out that great Lou Reed record last
Hmm.
week of his earliest music,
Hmm.
and the packaging. I don't have the deluxe one. I have the standard
Yeah.
release, but I was intrigued by the deluxe. Um, but also, I just want to say about indie records. I mean, indie record labels. Um, the book also gets into some of the stories behind the labels and how they jumped into it. You know, so specifically Sub Pop and Epitaph were
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
labels that were early supporters of Record Store Day, but also were doing it even before Record Store Day,
Mm.
especially on the singles side of
Yeah. Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I remember punk. I mean, I never participated, but I had a lot of friends in the early 2000s who were collecting punk 7 inches. And I mean, people criticize the teenage girls for buying records and not listening to them, but I had a lot of buddies who didn't have a turntable and were collecting 7 inch punk records in the early 2000s. Is
Oh,
there a place for tapes and CDs in this story? I mean, it's about record stores.
yeah.
Um, I kind of wonder, does the event run the risk of becoming elitist in any way with the emphasis on this big ticket 40, 50, $60 records?
Well,
Um,
I mean, the past few Record Store Days have had, well, it's not only the last few. I mean, going dating back to the earliest days, they've had CD releases on Record Store Day
mm,
with the Record Store Day stamp. They've also done some tapes, cassettes in recent years too. Um, so I don't know if it's the format, but I mean, I guess one of the reasons why the CD has had a bit of a resurgence was because there was a backlog in getting records pressed. And cassettes actually sort of benefited from that
yeah,
too. I don't think either one of them are going to return at the same level that
right.
vinyl has. Um,
I
but
would,
but
yeah.
there's a niche, and again, there's an intrigue by the younger generation about tapes,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
CDs to some extent. I mean, I I plan on making a list of my 100 favorite CDs. And these are things that it never came out on vinyl, probably will never come out in
Mm.
vinyl. And how I will never ever sell them. I
Interesting.
mean, I'm thinking about paring down, you know, now. Yeah, I said I sold most of my 4,000 LP record collection, but I've rebuilt it to around that same level after
Wow.
over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And is that thanks to Record Store Day?
no, actually,
No.
and here's one of the ironic, funny things about writing the book. Um, I didn't even know Record Store Day existed until I think it was like towards the end of 2013.
Wow.
Um, I was in my friend's record store and I came across this 12-inch EP of the Civil Wars, a band
Hmm.
that I heard a little bit on the radio, and I just loved. I mean, I'm not a huge country music fan, but I do have some favorites. And I just loved how the voices intertwined and everything like that. And there was a Record Store Day stamp on it. And I said to my friend, What's Record Store Day?" Like I was totally out to lunch
Wow.
because I was so new to getting back
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
that, you know. So he goes, "Oh, it's like this, sort of holiday that they put out limited edition stuff." And
Yeah. Yeah.
so the next April, I had the list in hand.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that 2014, April 2014, I was ready to go.
Yeah.
I read it online outside of another major store.
Gosh, the event of it and the scarcity of it, and I know a lot of record stores will do 25% off, or they'll do other things. They'll have giveaways of their own. I think that's what really makes it special is the fear of missing out.
That's exactly true.
Mm,
Yeah, FOMO.
yeah,
I think also you bring up a really good point. What if you own a record store that just only sells used product? Can you, celebrate Record Store Day?
right.
You can. The only thing you can't do, because you've already decided that you're not going to buy the Record Store Day releases, quote unquote releases. But you can have like a sale, 20% off on
Yeah,
that,
right.
and get people to come in and have bands play and, coffee and donuts or whatever you want to,
I was surprised to learn that the record stores aren't beholden to purchasing a minimum quantity of the exclusive releases or all of them. I found that to be interesting. I kind of had assumed that to be a participating store, you had to commit to $1,000, $5,000 worth of inventory, but that's not the case.
Well, that's really a relationship between the retailer and the distributor.
Mm,
And there are several distributors that handle Record Store Day releases. Um, but you're right. And I have the store that I was talking about where I first learned about Record Store Day. He spent about 4 years not doing Record Store Day because it was just getting too expensive for him. And this is the first year he's going back into it. I found out
mm,
last
mm,
week.
yeah,
And I said, "Well, how many pieces are you buying?" And he said, "Only, one or two." And he's
yeah,
selective with titles, and
yeah,
you know, um, yeah.
yeah.
So which is, I think, the right way to do it. Don't overextend yourself. I mean, but there are other stores that I'm friendly with that will buy almost everything available.
Yeah, I think it definitely comes down to the size of the store and the location of the store. I'm sure Grimey's would buy 100, 200 of every title and be fine, whereas, my some of my local stores in little towns, there's usually a box of Record Store Day titles that are available several months after the event.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, you can't expect everything was going to sell, but I think that's good that the variety is still there in the store, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
And the other thing, but getting back to the pandemic, is here's an example of Record Store Day loosening the previous rules. There used to be you couldn't sell your Record Store Day releases online. Well, now, because of health safety
yep,
reasons, they had this new rule that says, like, the day after,
right,
that morning, you can put them online, which I think was the right
absolutely.
strategy.
Yeah, yeah. So
And
the stores can
I
sell
think
them now?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Mhm.
and some people don't live near a record store,
Yeah,
so that
yeah,
might be the only way that they
yeah,
can get.
yeah.
Yeah, I had people plead with me, so I mean, this is the paperback version of it, but there was a Canadian buyer who wanted the hardcover that came with a limited edition record of Record Store Day, and that record store performances. It wasn't necessarily on Record Store Day.
Okay.
And I told him of one store that I knew had a lot of them in stock, but apparently the way the release was planned, it would only be sold in the US.
Uh,
Yeah, so I'm not sure if he eventually did get the. I felt bad for him.
yeah.
I didn't have one to give him myself, unfortunately. I
Yeah.
mean, it's funny. I only had 5 of them from the publisher, and I gave one to Jack White personally. I mailed one to Paul McCartney. I hope he received it.
Yeah.
um, I My daughter has one. I think I have 1 or 2 left.
One of the things I've been kind of advocating for, and I think the same is true for streaming, but I think that I don't have a problem with the price of vinyl. And I just bought a reissue vinyl for 44.99 here in Canada. There's really nothing special about it other than it was clear, but the record was recorded 50, 60 years ago, so they've already made their money on it. I didn't have a problem with it because of what I believe in, even though the the money's not going anywhere great, but I have no problem with the price going up because of the packaging that we're putting into it. The amount of, you talk a lot in your book about how it's a handmade product. So many people have their hands on it. And the vinyl manufacturing process, such a delicate process, and there's so many different components to it. We talked about that in our interview with Karen from Key Production Group. And it's just, people appreciate how much is involved in making this physical product. Not to mention the mastering engineers, the mix engineers, the recording engineers, and the artists themselves who have to write and perform these songs. So the idea of a finished record that's really beautiful, that's in color vinyl and maybe has some special inserts, the idea of that costing, I mean, that should cost $50. It should cost $100 if it's something that you're going to have for the rest of your life. What are your thoughts on price? Because I personally, one more thought. I mean, I just sent an order for a limited pressing of 200 records, and I'm doing the math, and I'm thinking there's 100 clear and 100 speckle, and you're getting one of 100 records. We should be able to charge $25, $30 for that and have no complaints. What are your thoughts about pricing?
Well, I've heard that, especially on the major label side, Universal has bumped up by a few dollars the
Mm-hmm.
suggested retail price.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how much of that is just jumping on the bandwagon and running with it versus passing on the costs, because the major labels are not pressing their own stuff anymore. They're outsourcing the stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
they're receiving the lion's share of the money that comes back.
Right, right.
They in some to some extent they'll license titles to other reissue labels and things like that. Like I said, the costs are a definite issue in terms of but one thing that you mentioned before about the colors, yeah, some consumers want that for collectability reasons. I personally don't care. I'm fine with a black record.
Yeah,
I do. That's not to say I don't have picture discs and some colored records, but and we actually do have a category in the Making Vinyl Packaging Awards for we call it record art, and I mean some of those things are just in fact I posted yesterday on the Making Vinyl Facebook page something from Women in Vinyl they had from Cascade in Oregon, how they make the splattered records, how it
right.
takes a puck and something. I had never seen that before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I was like, whoa, that is cool.
yeah.
So yeah, I have some of those records, but um it but does cost a little bit more when they make the
Oh,
special
sure. Yeah.
record.
They
So
got to clean the
so
machines and
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah.
So um
You,
I
you
think
you don't think price is getting out of hand, or you think prices are
you know
appropriate?
what I say is go to a used record store and comb the $3 section. You'll find amazing stuff.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, it's
And
true.
and even I mean, this is really interesting. I teach in Newark, New Jersey, at Rutgers University, which just went on strike yesterday, and I was walking the picket line. But at the university is the Institute of Jazz Studies. And I was already planning a trip for my class, my news writing class, there to do a special event. How here's this amazing resource right in your midst, and you don't even know it's here.
Yeah.
And in their collection, they have such things as Miles Davis's trumpet and
Wow.
Fitzgerald's wig and Billie Holiday's jewelry. I mean, it's really, really an
Yeah,
amazing
yeah.
tour. But I right before we were to do this field trip, Wayne Shorter died. Now, I knew Wayne Shorter a little bit from his work on with Miles Davis and Weather Report. My favorite Miles record is In a Silent Way, and Wayne was the sax player on that. But I'm reading his obituary, and he was born in Newark, and
Hmm.
I'm like, whoa, So I mean, here I'm teaching a bunch of like 20-year-olds, and maybe they'll take some pride in this. That they grew up in Newark, so did he,
Yeah. Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sure, they really, got into it. So getting back to your price issue, I go on Spotify and I realized one of Wayne's last releases was this manga opus of that he had thought about ever since he was a kid. He was into comic books, but he drew his like own graphic novels, and he had
Mm.
like this whole science fiction story. And so he collaborated. He was already in his 80s when he's doing this. Collaborated with an artist, and Blue Note came out with this book with this release that I think sold initially for about $150 or so, something like that, because it was a graphic novel,
Wow.
hardcover, and 3-record set and all the stuff, beautiful packaging.
Yeah.
And I listened to it on Spotify. I was mesmerized by it. I mean, because it wasn't even jazz; it was more classical music, actually, which I
Sure.
don't. I'm a neophyte,
Yeah.
but I was like, I have to have this on vinyl. So combing Amazon, which I usually try to stay away from, but
Sure.
sometimes
Yeah.
and I've found one for $160. It was out of print,
Not bad.
limited edition type of thing. Never like any kind of like version without the book
Oh, okay. Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Um, CDs were even the CD was really expensive as well.
Wow.
And the one I bought also came with the CD version of it.
Oh, cool.
So yeah. So and then I'm going through his records, and I find two of his studio records, and I checked. There's a really good jazz record store here in Manhattan. He was all out of Wayne Shorter. I wouldn't be surprised if they sold one, once he passed away or something.
Yeah,
Well,
that's right. Yeah.
so then this one album I can't find anywhere. It's his first as a band leader on Blue Note. And I go on eBay, and there it is for $22 sealed. Whereas Discogs, they were like $40-$50.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I mean, my point is, you should shop around.
Yeah.
On
Yeah. Yeah.
the other hand, you're right about FOMO though, because there have been times when I've seen records in stores, and for whatever reason I hesitated, didn't walk away with it, probably because I was buying other stuff or whatever, and I regret it.
Mm, mm.
It happens.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. Listen, I want our listeners to pick up this book because the whole story is very interesting. For me, what ends up happening in our culture, especially with the internet, is there are these grassroots things that happen. We all get behind it. We all love it. We all find the beauty in it. And then inevitably, people get jaded about things. And I feel like that in ways have happened with record store days, that people look for things to criticize. I found the book opened my eyes up to a lot of things that I maybe had, some myths that I had thought about. But what is so beautiful is that it's how it continues to excite people about the format and about record stores. And the proof is in the pudding. I mean, you can go to a record store any day of the week now and shop with other people. And so anyway, I want our folks to grab the book and to check it out. And thank you so much for doing this. It's been great to chat with you.
I appreciate that, Scott.